The mysterious darkness. In the spring of 536 AD, the sun disappeared, not in an eclipse that lasted minutes, but in a dimming that persisted for 18 months. Byzantine historian Procopius recorded that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. In China, officials documented that the sun shone weakly, as though in permanent eclipse. Irish annals spoke of a failure of bread. Across 3 continents, every civilization that kept records noted the same impossible phenomenon: the sky had gone dark, and no one understood why. This was not metaphor or exaggeration. Tree ring data from this period shows a sudden, dramatic decrease in growth, indicating a massive drop in photosynthesis worldwide. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica reveal a thick layer of volcanic sulfate particles deposited precisely in 536, blocking sunlight on a scale never seen before or since in recorded history. The global average temperature dropped by at least 2.5 degrees Celsius, triggering what scientists now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age. But here is what they do not teach in history courses. This darkness did not arrive randomly. It coincided with the eruption of a supervolcano in Iceland, an event so catastrophic that it injected millions of tons of ash and sulfur into the stratosphere, creating a veil that circled the entire planet. The eruption was followed by another massive volcanic event in 540, compounding the disaster. Yet for over 1,000 years, this period remained mysteriously absent from mainstream historical narratives, dismissed as mere folklore or religious apocalypticism. Modern archaeology only confirmed the extent of this catastrophe in the late 20th century, when interdisciplinary studies finally pieced together what ancient sources had been screaming all along. Humanity experienced an extinction-level environmental collapse, and the evidence was systematically ignored. The Volcanic Winter. The volcanic eruptions that caused the darkness of 536 triggered something far worse than dim sunlight. They initiated a volcanic winter that lasted for over a decade, the most severe climate catastrophe in recorded human history. When supervolcanoes erupt with such magnitude, they do not simply darken the sky temporarily, they fundamentally alter atmospheric chemistry, creating a sulfuric acid aerosol layer that reflects solar radiation back into space, preventing warmth from reaching the Earth's surface. Temperature reconstructions from ice cores and tree rings show that summer temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped to levels normally seen in winter. Snow fell in summer months across Europe and Asia. In Mesopotamia, one of the warmest regions on Earth, frost destroyed crops in August. The growing season collapsed entirely in some regions, shrinking from 6 months to barely 2. This was not a localized weather event, but a hemispheric climate shift that persisted year after year with no relief. What mainstream climatology often glosses over is the compounding effect of the second eruption in 540. Just as ecosystems began recovering from the initial shock, another massive injection of volcanic material reset the catastrophe, extending the winter for another half-decade. Modern climate models suggest that if a similar double eruption sequence occurred today, global food production would collapse within 18 months, leading to the death of billions. Yet this precise scenario unfolded in the 6th century, and humanity had no scientific framework to understand it, no global supply chains to buffer the losses, no technological resilience whatsoever. The volcanic winter of 536 to 550 did not simply make life difficult. It created conditions incompatible with human survival across vast stretches of the planet, and what followed was suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. The Great Famine. When crops failed across the entire northern hemisphere simultaneously, humanity faced something it had never encountered before: a synchronized global famine. In normal famines, trade routes could bring relief from unaffected regions, but in 536, there were no unaffected regions. From Scandinavia to North Africa, from Britain to China, harvests collapsed in unison. Wheat withered in the fields, rice paddies froze, orchards produced no fruit. Livestock died from cold and starvation, eliminating meat, milk, and leather. Within months, granaries emptied, and civilizations built on agricultural surplus found themselves with nothing to eat. Contemporary accounts describe horrors that read like fiction. In Italia, people ate tree bark, grass, and eventually each other. Gregory of Tours documented parents abandoning children because they could not feed them, and instances of cannibalism becoming so common that laws were passed specifically addressing it. In China, The Northern Wei dynasty recorded that people were selling their children for food, and when no buyers could be found, infanticide became routine. The Persian Empire saw entire cities depopulated as residents fled into the countryside searching for anything edible, only to find the same desolation everywhere. But here is what gets buried in academic discussions of this period. The famine did not affect all social classes equally. Historical records show that elites hoarded remaining food supplies, using military force to protect grain stores while peasants starved in the streets. The Byzantine Empire under Justinian continued exporting grain to maintain trade relationships and political leverage, even as its own provinces experienced mass death. Those in power chose geopolitical strategy over humanitarian relief, a pattern that would repeat throughout history but began in its most naked form during the darkness of 536. The famine killed an estimated 15 to 20 million people in Europe alone, with comparable death tolls across Asia, yet it remains largely absent from popular historical consciousness, overshadowed by plagues and wars. The Plague of Justinian. In 541, just as humanity began recovering from over a decade of darkness and famine, a new catastrophe emerged from the weakened, starving populations. The first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague. Modern DNA analysis of plague victims from this period confirms it was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would later cause the Black Death, but this earlier outbreak was far more devastating in its global reach and lethality. The Plague of Justinian, named after the Byzantine emperor who survived it, killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide, roughly 13% of the global population. The plague arrived in Constantinople through grain ships from Egypt, spreading with terrifying speed through a population already weakened by malnutrition and exposure. At its peak, the disease killed 10,000 people per day in the capital alone. Bodies piled in the streets faster than they could be buried. Justinian ordered the construction of mass graves, but even these could not accommodate the dead. Eventually, the roofs of fortification towers were removed, and corpses were simply stacked inside until the towers overflowed. The stench of rotting flesh permeated the city for months. What epidemiologists now understand but rarely emphasize is that the plague emerged directly from the conditions created by the volcanic winter. Famine forces rodent populations into closer contact with humans as they search for food. Weakened immune systems cannot fight infections. Disrupted sanitation systems create perfect vectors for disease transmission. The plague was not a separate disaster, but the inevitable biological consequence of the environmental collapse that preceded it. Yet Byzantine authorities, unable to comprehend germ theory, attributed the disease to divine punishment, leading to policies that worsened transmission rather than containing it. The plague returned in waves for the next 2 centuries, each outbreak killing millions more, but the initial pandemic of 541 occurred at the absolute worst possible moment, striking populations that had already lost everything. The fall of civilizations. The combined weight of darkness, famine, and plague did not simply kill individuals. It shattered entire civilizations that had stood for centuries. The Aksumite Empire in East Africa, one of the great powers of the ancient world, collapsed completely between 536 and 550, never to recover its former glory. In Mesoamerica, the great city of Teotihuacan, which had dominated central Mexico for half a millennium, was abandoned during this exact period. Archaeological evidence shows sudden depopulation, unfinished construction projects, and evidence of systemic collapse, all dating to the mid-6th century. The Western Roman Empire, which had already fragmented politically, lost its last vestiges of organized urban life during this period. Cities that had maintained some continuity from classical times were abandoned as populations fled or died. The sophisticated road networks, aqueducts, and administrative systems that had defined Roman civilization ceased functioning. Knowledge of concrete making, advanced engineering, and literacy rates plummeted and would not recover for centuries. This was not the gradual decline that historians often describe, but a sudden, catastrophic rupture in civilizational continuity. In the East, the Göktürk Khaganate emerged from the chaos, but only by conquering and absorbing the collapsing sedentary civilizations around them. The Northern Wei dynasty in China splintered into rival kingdoms. The Sasanian Persian Empire survived, but was so weakened that it fell to Arab conquest within a century. something unthinkable before 536. Yet mainstream historical narratives attribute these collapses to political factors, military defeats, or cultural decline, systematically avoiding the environmental catastrophe that was the actual trigger. The fall of civilizations in the mid-6th century was not inevitable historical evolution. It was the direct result of a planetary disaster that academic historians only reluctantly acknowledged 17 centuries later, and even now, the connections remain buried in specialized literature rather than taught as the pivotal catastrophe it truly was. The silencing of historical records. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the 536 catastrophe is how thoroughly it was erased from historical memory. In the immediate aftermath, chroniclers documented the darkness, famine, and plague with vivid detail. But within a few generations, these accounts began disappearing from official records. Libraries burned. Monasteries that preserved manuscripts were abandoned. The deliberate destruction of knowledge during this period was not accidental but systematic, carried out by institutions that had specific reasons to suppress the true scale of what had occurred. The Byzantine Church, which had attributed the disasters to divine wrath against heretics, had every incentive to ensure future generations did not scrutinize their theological explanations too closely. Official histories commissioned by Justinian emphasized his reconquest campaigns and legal reforms while minimizing the environmental collapse that killed half his empire. Chinese dynastic histories, written by succeeding regimes, blamed the disasters on the moral failures of previous rulers, rather than acknowledging an uncontrollable natural catastrophe that exposed the fragility of all human power. By the medieval period, the catastrophe of 536 had been reduced to scattered mentions in monastic chronicles, fragmented references that seemed like religious metaphor rather than documentary evidence. Renaissance historians, rediscovering classical texts, focused on the glory of Rome and dismissed 6th century sources as products of Dark Age superstition. Enlightenment scholars, building narratives of progressive human development, had no framework for incorporating a global collapse that contradicted their theories. It was not until the 1990s, when climate scientists analyzing ice cores discovered the volcanic signatures, that the pieces finally connected. Tree ring specialists, working independently, found the growth anomalies. Archaeologists noticed the simultaneous collapse layers. Suddenly, the fragmented historical accounts made sense as descriptions of a real, documented catastrophe. But even now, this revelation remains confined to academic journals and specialized documentaries, absent from standard history curricula that continue teaching the 6th century as merely a transition period between ancient and medieval worlds. The economic collapse. The darkness of 536 did not merely destroy crops. It annihilated the entire economic foundation of the ancient world. Trade routes that had functioned for centuries collapsed overnight, as regions that once exported grain found themselves starving. The Mediterranean shipping network, which had sustained commerce since Phoenician times, largely ceased operations as there was nothing to transport and no one who could afford to buy. Monetary systems failed as precious metals became worthless when there was no food to purchase with them. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a dramatic decline in coin circulation, pottery production, and metalworking. Blacksmiths could not operate without charcoal, which required wood from forests that were being stripped for fuel and emergency food. Textile production halted when flax and wool supplies disappeared. The specialized crafts that defined urban civilization required agricultural surplus to sustain non-farming artisans, and that surplus had vanished. Within a decade, complex economies reverted to subsistence bartering, and in many regions, even that became impossible. But here is what economic historians rarely acknowledge. The collapse was not uniform. Certain groups, particularly those controlling remaining food stockpiles and those with access to precious metals stored before the crisis, emerged with unprecedented power. The concentration of wealth that occurred during the 536 catastrophe fundamentally restructured social hierarchies in ways that persist to this day. The feudal system that dominated medieval Europe was not a natural evolution from Roman institutions, but a direct consequence of the power dynamics created when food became the only real currency. The Byzantine state, despite losing half its population, managed to maintain control precisely because Justinian had centralized grain storage in imperial warehouses before the disaster struck. This allowed the government to survive while local aristocracies collapsed. but it also meant that recovery was dictated by imperial priorities rather than humanitarian needs. The economic collapse of 536 was not simply destructive, it was transformative, reshaping power structures in ways that those in control had every reason to preserve and no reason to honestly document. The mass migrations and warfare. As regions became uninhabitable, entire populations began moving, triggering a cascade of conflicts that reshaped the ethnic and political map of Eurasia. The Lombards invaded Italia in 568, not as conquerors seeking glory but as refugees fleeing regions where the climate catastrophe had made survival impossible. The Avars pushed westward into Europe, displacing other groups in a domino effect of mass migration. These were not the organized military campaigns depicted in traditional histories, but desperate movements of starving peoples searching for any land that could sustain them. Contemporary sources describe horrific scenes along migration routes. Thousands died of exposure and starvation during the journeys. Conflicts erupted wherever migrating groups encountered settled populations, both sides fighting for resources that no longer existed in sufficient quantities for anyone. The violence was not ideological or territorial in the traditional sense. It was purely about survival, with groups exterminating each other over access to arable land and potable water. The Anglo-Saxon migration into Britain, traditionally dated earlier, intensified dramatically during this period as continental populations fled westward. The Slavic expansion across Eastern Europe occurred simultaneously, filling the vacuum left by collapsed Gothic kingdoms. In Asia, Turkic tribes pushed southward into Persian and Chinese territories. Every region of the Northern Hemisphere experienced demographic upheaval, yet modern historians typically describe these movements as separate, unrelated events driven by local political factors. What remains buried in academic literature is the evidence that these migrations were coordinated responses to the same underlying environmental disaster. Genetic studies now show that populations mixed during the mid-6th century in ways that had not occurred before, confirming massive simultaneous movements across continents. But acknowledging this would require admitting that climate catastrophe, not human agency, drove the reshaping of civilizations, and that remains an uncomfortable truth for narratives built on great men and political strategies rather than environmental determinism. The psychological devastation. Beyond the physical deaths and material destruction, the catastrophe of 536 inflicted psychological trauma on a scale that permanently altered human consciousness. Imagine living in a world where the sun itself had failed, where no religious authority could explain what was happening, where every certainty about the order of nature had been shattered. Contemporary accounts describe mass hysteria, widespread belief that the world was ending, and complete breakdowns of social cohesion as people abandoned all norms in the face of incomprehensible disaster. The plague added another layer of psychological horror. Unlike famine, which at least followed a logical progression from crop failure to starvation, the plague struck randomly and invisibly. Healthy people died within days with no apparent cause. Families watched loved ones develop bubios, black swellings that appeared overnight and brought agonizing death. No prayers helped, no physicians could treat it. The disease respected no social hierarchy, killing emperors and peasants with equal efficiency. The psychological impact of such randomized, unexplainable death created a fatalism that persisted for generations. Religious institutions, which had provided meaning and structure, lost credibility as their explanations proved worthless, and their rituals failed to stop the dying. This led to both intensified religious fanaticism and widespread abandonment of faith, fragmenting communities along lines of belief and disbelief. Artistic production from the period shows a dramatic shift toward apocalyptic themes, demons, and visions of hell, reflecting a collective psyche that had been traumatized beyond recovery. Modern psychology recognizes that mass trauma events create epigenetic changes that affect subsequent generations. The survivors of 536 passed down not just memories, but fundamental alterations in stress response, threat perception, and worldview. The medieval period's preoccupation with death, its acceptance of suffering, and its fatalistic outlook were not cultural choices, but the inherited psychological scars of a generation that had witnessed the near extinction of humanity. Yet this dimension remains almost entirely absent from historical analysis, which treats medieval consciousness as disconnected from the catastrophe that created it. The erased knowledge. The greatest loss of 536 was not the people who died, or the civilizations that fell, but the knowledge that vanished forever. The ancient world possessed technologies, mathematical understanding, and scientific insights that would not be rediscovered for over 1,000 years. And much of it was lost during the chaos of the mid-6th century. Libraries burned not just in Alexandria, which had already declined, but in Constantinople, Rome, Ctesiphon, and Changjiang. Monasteries and academies that preserved scientific texts were abandoned as populations fled or died. What little survived did so by accident rather than preservation effort. The knowledge of Roman engineering, which had created structures still standing today, was lost so thoroughly that medieval builders could not replicate the achievements of their ancestors. Medical texts that documented surgical procedures and pharmaceutical preparations were destroyed, forcing medicine backward by centuries. Mathematical treatises that had reached sophisticated levels of algebra and geometry vanished, leaving only fragments that later Islamic scholars would have to reconstruct from Greek sources that themselves were incomplete copies. But here is what remains most disturbing. Some knowledge was not lost accidentally but suppressed deliberately. As religious authorities consolidated power in the post-catastrophe world, they actively destroyed works they deemed heretical or dangerous. Scientific materialism threatened theological explanations of the disaster. Texts that promoted rational inquiry over faith-based acceptance were targeted. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is famous, but the systematic destruction of knowledge that occurred during and after 536 was far more comprehensive and deliberately executed. By the time the Renaissance began recovering classical knowledge, 17 centuries had passed. Scholars rediscovering ancient texts were astonished at the sophistication they found, unable to comprehend how such knowledge could have been lost. But it was not lost through neglect or time. It was erased by the catastrophe of 536 and the power structures that emerged from it, structures that required ignorance rather than enlightenment to maintain control. Humanity did not slowly progress from darkness to light. It plunged from light into darkness in 536, and we are still climbing out of that abyss, still recovering knowledge that our ancestors possessed and that those in power deemed too dangerous to preserve.